That's yours. Is that yours?
Yeah.
Okay. That's someone else's. I can go in there. It's okay, it's all done.
It's all done?
It's all done.
Okay, thanks. Once I'm there, I'm there. But usually someone is doing for everyone.
I know, but it's like horrible. It's like, you know, honestly, like, you know, it's horrible. I'm gonna cook it.
I'll tell more about
But no one looking for it.
Yeah. What they will do.
I'll just like fix it. Like, it'll be, okay, it will build it as well. Spaghetti, salt it up. Fresh one, please. Is this gold? This is not. This is gold. This one is not. Is it clean? No, that's yours. Okay.
Hello. Hello. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. My name is Craig Ng. I'm the General Counsel of APNIC, so APNIC's legal counsel. This session is about cross-border internet relationships in Asia. In more particular, we're going to talk a little bit about cross-border data flow. You know, what the problems are, what are the solutions. You know, with the globalization of data flow and cloud computing and things like that, Internet of Things, a lot of the data is now held internationally, globally, everywhere. Law enforcement agencies have been having immense difficulty trying to access data across jurisdiction. The globalization of the data flow has created a lot of challenges. You know, for the community, not just the law enforcement. I think the law enforcement is kind of at the top end of the issue because they are the one who has to address rights and seek to redress breaches of individuals' rights. So, how do you enforce individual rights? You know, in terms of privacy, in terms of harassment, in terms of child protection, where you have a victim in one country, you've got a perpetrator in another country, and you've got data and evidence which is held in a third country. The existing system of accessing this data through the Budapest Convention, through MLAT, the Mutual Legal Assistance Treaty, has traditionally takes a very, very long time, 9 months, I think, at the shortest, in most cases. So how do you deal with that? Law enforcement are facing the similar issues, you know, warrants and execution out of jurisdiction in order to gather evidence to investigate the crime in the first place before even talking about prosecution. So lots of countries have come up with different solutions. Countries are using extraterritoriality and extrajurisdictional claim, extra-jurisdictional claim in order to assert their legal right to data about their subjects in their countries or in other countries. You know, it's becoming almost like a competition of which jurisdiction can assert a higher degree of authority over data, over people. And when you have conflicting laws, what do you do? So a lot of interesting subject matter here. You know, in terms of privacy, there's always a tension between law enforcement wanting more access to more data versus human rights and rights to privacy and rights to have your anonymity preserved. So where does that lie? You know, where's that line? So in today's session, I've got some really good panelists here. I've got Yusu here, who's from Korea. She's going to talk about some of the problems that exist because of this multi-jurisdictional issue. And very interesting, I think right now there's an ex-ICANN director, Bertrand de la Chapelle, who's running a conference in Ottawa talking about exactly the same thing. But I think they're taking three days and we're finishing this in 60 minutes, or 90 minutes. So I think we're a lot more efficient over here. So Yusu is going to be talking about raising some of the issues, the questions, and posing some possible solutions, and it will be wonderful if you from the community can participate and let us know what you think about those solutions. I've got Jing from China, CAICT, who will talk about the efforts and the solutions that some countries have come up in terms of enacting laws to overcome this jurisdictional problem. It'll be interesting for us to have a look at these different systems of laws to try to address the issue and get your opinion as to whether you think they work. I've got Babu, who's a Nepalese lawyer, actually also wearing a lot of different hats in the internet governance space, and he'll talk about some of the cases in Nepal and the problem with the jurisdiction. So without further ado, I'll introduce Yesu Kim from Korea. She's worked in the internet governance and internet policy for 8 years now. She's been working with the Creative Commons Korea Internet Governance Alliance, and has been a fellow of the APSIG and APR-IGF. Last year, Yesu held a session about internet governance and a multi-stakeholder model in South Korea and other countries in KR IGF, and had presented a paper in STS Italia in 2016 about legal and cultural differences in internet community in different countries. Her interest and research effort centers around the convergence, coherence, and cooperation of policies on the internet technology among nations in general, and have been working to bridge gaps happening with the fast development of the technology and legal policy vacuum to properly govern the technologies for the general good of the people. Will you help me in welcoming Yesu, please?
Thank you. So I'm going to present my presentation materials from here. So thank you for attending this session first. So my presentation will be about policy and technical solutions for online cross-border legal problems in Asia. Okay, thank you. Okay, got it. So this map shows how laws are differing from country to country about data protection. So the red color shows that the countries with red color, it shows that they have high level of data protection laws, and the green color, it shows that the color with green, the countries with green color, it shows that the countries have smaller or low level of data protection. So I thought that this map somehow summarizes how there can be some kind of a wide variety of legal vacuums or legal differences among countries. So there are actually a lot, a growing number of legal concerns or legal cases because of this rapid increase in cross-border data transactions. So it's not only about content or data transaction, it's also about e-commerce, SNS usage. So I've tried to I tried to summarize several cases which have happened over the past several years. So the first one, so the first case is Nepal Australia case. It hasn't been actually brought to the court, so there was no proper, right? There was no proper.
We have law, but still there are some technical limitations and some jurisdictional issues are also there. So because of that, there are certain limitations in investigation in that kind of cases.
Okay, so anyway, so there was this legal case that nude photos of a Nepalese woman were posted online by a Nepalese man who now lives in Australia. So Nepal was somehow trying or struggling to find some legal technical solutions to solve this issue, but I think no remedies have been actually sought for the harms that has been done to the woman. And there has been some kind of data transaction or privacy concerns raised by imported IoT cameras. For example, in South Korea, there has been some kind of customer claims that they are somehow watched by IoT cameras imported by China. And there also has been some kind of news articles saying that U.S. has actually banned the import of IoT cameras which have been produced by China because of all these kind of data transaction issues. So and on top of this, increasing volume of e-commerce and online commercial transactions, it will also somehow bring more and more diverse legal problems. So areas of law to be impacted, I think it covers almost all areas of law, from criminal law to civil law, which also includes libel cases, harassment cases, child protection, human rights, and also copyright laws, and also including intellectual property law. So I just tried to bring some kind of past cases which were brought actually to the courts in Europe and North America. So actually these kind of internet related legal cases have been already brought to the courts several times or a lot of times already in European countries and North American countries. So for example, Lyrica versus the US, it was really famous case in internet related legal disputes. So Yahoo, so in this case, Yahoo was actually somehow like, so like French court actually decided or like ordered Yahoo to take down Nazi emblems or Nazi products from like French domicile, from France, and Yahoo finally complied with the order of French court in this case. And like Google and like acoustic solutions, I think it's still going on. And what's happening in this case is that like Canadian court actually like ordered Google to take down some kind of like content or some kind of like site websites from like globally, but like Google actually thought that that doesn't make any sense. So the like U.S. court actually decided that like the law, the rulings which have been like given by Canadian court cannot be actually like delivered inside the U.S. territory. And EU GDPR, it's actually like still finally impacts like companies domiciled outside the EU territory. So I thought that like extraterritoriality somehow started to be coded into the laws. So like possible legal solutions, there can be like several possible legal solutions for these kind of like cases. For example, like takedown request, I think like this like takedown request has been brought, or it has been somehow, yeah, takedown request and order is the current most sought after solutions for online content related lawsuits. And like there are also some kind of like WTO commerce laws which govern all these kind of issues. So like, for example, IoT camera like imports and like exports, it's not only about like data transaction, but it's also about like the manufacturing of the camera itself, and so that it can be actually regulated by all these like WTO commerce laws as well. So, and as like on top of this, like in addition to this, cross-border arbitrations, it can happen, but like it actually consumes a lot of like time, money, and efforts from all parties involved. So like at this point, like each government and national courts are now like somehow like trying to tame the cyberspace, but like without the concerted efforts of the regional leaders, policymakers, and technicians, only the like complexities within the cyberspace will increase. So to go deeper into the course of like cross-border arbitration. So cross-border litigation can happen, but like it actually requires a lot of like procedures, such as contacting a foreign lawyer, and it also requires travel costs of the parties. It also consumes translation costs as well, and it all somehow like sometimes outweigh the benefits from the lawsuit. And there are also choice of law and conflict of law issues. So how can you guarantee the coordinated efforts to mitigate the cyber conflicts without compromising the legal plurality? This is the question here. So I'll just skip this slide. So like what's happening right now, like current legal and policy development is actually happening right now. For example, UNGG, but like it's only applicable to the nations, which have been like decided and made in like UNGG. So it doesn't actually necessarily like govern like the personality or like private person inside, like which are actively engaged in like online communities. And there is also like Hague International Private Law being developed to govern all these kind of like conflict law issues. But like, unlike like European regions where GCSE, like internet-related legal harmonization efforts, research into law and coordination of efforts have been extensively conducted. But like Asian countries are still lacking in the legal harmonization and cooperative efforts to fight against all these cyber crimes. So these are all like organizations or some kind of like activities which have been initiated like all over the world. For example, Internet and Jurisdiction, which have been like already introduced by like Craig. It's also dealing with all these kind of issues right at this moment in Canada. Yeah, right now. And Diplo Foundation, they have been also actively involved in all these kind of issues as well. GCSE, like I said. And if you visit like Harvard Cyber Law Center, Stanford Cyber Law Center, you can easily find all these like the whole list of really complicated legal issues which have been brought by the internet technology. And there are some like journals which are dealing with all these like IoT related laws as well. So I think you can just like go into website and just find some journals, articles, so that you can refer to. So like what kind of like legal solutions can be brought actually? So like this is also about like jurisdictional problem, which really complicates all this issue. So like what's like rules on jurisdiction? It's actually not international law at this moment, but it's part of like domestic laws of civil procedure in each national legal system. So it's really like hard to decide in which jurisdiction this case can be brought to. And this really complicates all these like cross-boundary, like cross-national legal cases happening right now. But like in the EU, they have like their own regional harmonization of the related laws through a number of treaties, such as the Brussels regulation. But like as I said already, like still Asian countries still somehow lack this kind of like legal harmonization or legal cooperation. So, for example, I just wanted to bring some more detailed example of like what kind of law or what kind of like cases can be really impacted. So like, for example, tort law and jurisdiction. Like if defamation case happens, as I said, as I've already introduced in the beginning, the Nepalese woman case. So like the place, usually it's where the place where the tort was committed or the place where the damage occurred. These are like the two core elements to be decided where this case can be like presided. And it also needs some kind of, from the legal perspective, like effects doctrine, it can also be thought out. So for example, like according to the effects doctrine, the accessibility or targeting or the origin approach, it can be like brought into the consideration when it comes to deciding the jurisdiction of the case. Like for example, like the first accessibility, it's about like how or like from where the data has been accessed. Or number two, targeting, it's about like who, like from the beginning, who the target or which like area this data is targeting to impact. And the third is the origin approach. It's about like where this content has been originated. So like according to these kind of like principles, the jurisdiction can be decided. I'll just skip this slide. So like there has been already a number of cases brought to the court in the US and the European countries. In the European countries and American or North American countries. So for example, Dow Jones versus Skotnick, it was also about like locating the place of a tort. And like Chevelle case, it actually happened in 1995, and it wasn't actually about the internet case, but it was about like which like this publication has, it was also about like deciding the jurisdiction of this case. So like in Chevelle case, for example, the publisher of a newspaper who was like domiciled in France somehow impacted or somehow like made some kind of explicit comments about UK personnel. So like in this case, where this case should be brought into. So like according to ECJ, this should have been like presided according to the Brussels regulation, but it's already like based on the treaties made within like European countries. So it's not only about like legal issues. What I thought was that it's also about like contending philosophies, because it's like as I've already presented like in the beginning, as I've already introduced in the beginning, the laws are like totally different from one country to another, and it all like holds some kind of like ethos that like each country have written in their like laws. So it's not just about like some legal content. It's also about like clash of civilization, to exaggerate a little bit more. So like for example, privacy and free speech. Like laws about like privacy and free speech, it just differs from one country to another in very diverse ways. So privacy from EU perspective, privacy from the US perspective is just totally different. So like if disputes arise even from like different courts, how can be governed, especially inside the online communities? So do the internet community or the world as a whole need some kind of like new international norms? So I just wanted to ask this question to the audience so that like we can somehow like discuss what can be done by technical and legal and policy communities all together. So then what kind of initiatives have been done or have been happening in Asia Pacific region? So like New Delhi and Evolution Internet conferences happened like last year already. And like APRIGF, APNIC, APRICOT, it's all about like all these kind of like harmonization and cooperation of like legal and technical issues about like what's happening in the internet community, right? So, but like still the Asian countries somehow like lag behind in dealing with all these issues which have been already like presented here. So I thought it would be really important to bring this issue to like APRICOT today. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Yesu. I think Yesu has raised some interesting points about a clash of cultures and clash of national interests. I think it's important to also recognize that in the examples that Yesu ran about IoT devices, for example, made in China that's banned in US, I think we shouldn't read anything more into that other than that US could be paranoid and asserting their national interest, just like other countries would assert their national interest in different ways. So I think I need to make that clear. But it's a good example of how different countries use the mechanism of different laws to seemingly protect themselves or their citizens, but there could be ulterior motives behind it. And they're seeking to use extraterritoriality in order to assert that, and you end up with countries having a fight. I want to actually, at the end of the speeches or the presentation, talk a little bit more about the most recent cases of the Google case that you mentioned, which is a fight between Canadian courts and US courts and fight for supremacy. So a Canadian court ordering Google to do something relating to the global internet, which a US court has then subsequently denies and says that Google does not have to comply with the Canadian decision. So that's one example. The other one is Microsoft trying to the US Department of Justice trying to order Microsoft in America to release data that is held in Microsoft Ireland to law enforcement agencies in the US, and what US is doing about that. So some interesting sort of questions coming up. But first, I want to go to Babu at the moment. Babu is the lawyer in Nepal. To talk about some of the local cases affecting jurisdiction here. Babu is the Chief Executive Officer of Kathmandu-based ICT law firm Delta Law Private Limited. He's an expert member of cyber law, cyber security of the National Information and Communications Technology and Apex ICT policy body, and has over 17 years experience in mass media, telecoms, internet and cyber law. Babu has significant intervention at national and international level research on law and policy. Some of the major research he has engaged are trend of cyber crimes in Nepal, review of ICT laws of Nepal, use of criminal law, curbing freedom of expression. So he's one of the consultants of the draft of ICT Bill 2017. Babu Arial is Vice Chair of the Multi-Stakeholder Steering Group of Nepal IGF and Program Committee Chair of Nepal School of Internet Governance. Babu, it would be great if you could share with us some experience you have in litigation in cases involving Nepalese people.
Thank you, Craig. It's my pleasure to be here after Yesu's presentation. It's very simple for me because most of the theoretical sides he already covered. From practical perspective, as a litigant lawyer based in Kathmandu, especially focused on cybercrime cases, we have been experienced various technical and legal issues to address various criminal cases. For example, the kind of cases like Yesul at the beginning said, there are some cross-jurisdictional issues. If we go through the informal statistics of criminal cases, cybercrime cases in Nepal, almost more than 70% cases are either with Facebook or Google or basically social networking sites and communications sites. So most of them, they engage in cross-border exchange of data. For example, sending email through Google, obviously that crosses various jurisdictions, and we don't have any official office of big corporate giants like Facebook, Google's, and like similar kind of service providers. In such kind of case, in most of the case, when our law enforcement agencies require certain information and they ask to those corporates who are based in either Europe or US, they say we are not abide by your jurisdictional legal frameworks, and our standard and their standard are different. For example, having headquarters in USA, they say, for example, in Facebook related matters, they say, go through our community standard policy. If you come through that policy, then we'll respond on your reports. Then, but there are some issues like community standard of Nepal and community standard of USA is totally different. We have a different local context, culture, and practice, and they have different local culture and practice and legal provision as well. So in that kind of case, it's very difficult to protect the victims. So there are some cases, for example, as you said, there was one case, without naming the case, a person sitting in Nepal was sending some web-based SMS and web-based information to a lady in Australia, and Australian Interpol intervened on that, and after having some research on that, investigation on that, they made one report and they sent to that report to Interpol Nepal police, and Nepal police started investigating, getting on that case, and later on that person was prosecuted. In that case, even for example, if cross-border issues are involved, there should be certain level of international legal framework. For example, Europe, they have European Convention on Cybercrime, which is very effectively enforced in Europe and US, and I think in Asia, Sri Lanka and Japan are part of that European Convention. But most of the Asian countries, including our other neighboring countries where we have significant data transactions, we don't have access in that conference and then that convention, and we don't have any other international conventions. We also don't have any bilateral treaties like AMLAT and that kind of things. We don't have that kind of legal instrument. So in that kind of case, there are very difficult situations where our law enforcement agencies are not able to address this kind of cases. So to protect interest of that kind of victims, we need certain level of international cooperation on this, and this could be international convention on cyberspace or that kind of thing. And also we need to have more discussions among the law enforcement agencies and lawmaking bodies to develop practical, compatible frameworks in that area that as well discussed just now. So these are some things that we have. Law we have, but while having international exchange of data, then it's very difficult to address that thing. This is the current situation in my country. Thank you. If we have any further discussion, I'll be happy to join the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Babu. Thank you. Babu raised a really good question, actually. I think I have been involved with some of the colleagues here in engaging with the law enforcement agencies around the world, with Interpol, in Korea, International Cybercrime Symposium. And one of the big solutions that is kind of appearing by themselves is that for terrorism, for crimes, a lot of it happened over email, through Gmail, or through Facebook, or through Microsoft, through Twitter. And all of them are in the US or in the Europe. And so a lot of them, through pressure from us and from the law enforcement agencies, have very good and strong terms of service with their customers and with their subscribers that allow them to release information to law enforcement agencies. So it's a case of the law not catching up, and the service providers such as Facebook, Twitter, Google, being forced through community pressure to have these sort of terms in their contract. And that allows law enforcement agencies to access data for investigation and for prosecution in a lot quicker way than otherwise. But Babu raised a really good question, and that is that those giants are based in US and based in Europe. And US laws and European laws can now be created to bind them and indirectly regulate us. And so what about us? What about smaller countries where they have no presence, where the jurisdictional limits of those, of our law doesn't apply to these people, these countries? GDPR is an interesting thing, and I hope we have a chance to talk a little bit about that, because are you all familiar with GDPR? Hands up if you are. So the General Data Protection Law in the EU countries, colloquially or amongst the lawyers known as the Google law, because it's really trying to address Google, and it can do that because Google has presence there. But indirectly, it's affecting all of us, because at the ICANN conference, people are talking about nothing else but about GDPR. So interesting thing to talk about this kind of clash of law and clash of, again, where I started, where countries are seeking to use law to reach out and get people that are actually not in their country, so beyond their jurisdictional boundary and affecting the sovereignty of other countries. That's not my personal opinion, by the way. This is just an assessment of what's going on. On that note, I think I want to introduce our next panel speaker, who is Jing Di. Jing Di is from China. She's the service manager of the Information Management Center for the Chinese Academy of Information and Communications Technology. How do you say that in shorthand? CAICT? No, CAICT is you, CAICT, from Beijing in China. Her current interests are mainly focusing on network and information privacy, big data, and open government data. She was previously the project manager of Data Services Division in China Mobile. Will you join me in welcoming Jing Di?
Good afternoon, everybody. And I'll try to introduce something about the cross-border data flow. Could you stop it?
Just press.
Can stop?
Can you stop the music?
Stop the music. Okay. Thank you. Okay, hello, good afternoon, everyone. And I'll introduce the cross-border data flow management measures about international countries and organizations. And first, I'll introduce some definitions of the CBDF. I'll call it CBDF for short in my next illustrations. Sorry. Sorry, just it displayed mutually. Sorry. So could you stop it? Just. 这个怎么？ Oh, wait me a moment, everyone.
While we're sorting out the technical issues, does anyone, look, I might actually I think I see Juha over there. Juha is a journalist from New Zealand, and you've written on the Microsoft case and the US law. Are you happy to, perhaps I'll get you to share, some background about the Microsoft case and, with the Irish data, and also what the US government is trying to do to address that? Can you perhaps either come up here or at the stage, up to you? So Juha has been following this case, and I've read some of his articles in itnews.com.
This one, com.au.
.au.
Yeah, that's the one. Hi, everyone. I've been following it since around about 2013 when it first happened, and it's been like this sort of intractable knot, which neither party, not the US government, nor Microsoft, have been able to resolve. And it seemed like a very sort of simple case of just getting hold of some criminals' emails, but it's stored in Ireland, which means that Irish law comes into play. So the principle here is one that I didn't know about before, but it's a fancy legal word called comity, which Craig is probably familiar with. And that means that you, as a nation, you don't interfere with other nations. You play nicely with each other. So that means that you respect the other country's law. You don't try and get your domestic law to apply to the other country. And this is what happened in the Microsoft, that's probably better. Yes. Microsoft versus the US government case is that the US used domestic law to basically get the emails and issue a warrant under that. And Microsoft said, well, you can't do that because we talk about Irish law. Irish privacy laws have to apply and everything else. So the privacy commissioners of Ireland, New Zealand and other countries have written to support the, basically Microsoft in this case, they're saying that, look, we need to respect the laws of other countries and work out some better way of doing it through mutual assistance treaties and that sort of stuff. And I think it's probably going to be resolved now because the US Congress and eventually the Senate are working on a way to get around this, just basically to resolve the issue and make it possible for the US government to authorize speaking to foreign governments to get the data if need to be, and then it will be done according to the rules and laws of that nation. So it's more respectful and probably better for everyone. You have due process, not some sort of strange American law that applies. And one thing that the New Zealand Privacy Commissioner mentioned to me was that the US has a death penalty, so which New Zealand obviously doesn't have, or into trouble for that. So they're getting stuck. So it's obviously quite an important issue to get sorted out so that you have something in place internationally that works for everybody and doesn't kill off cloud computing in the process, because it will unless it's sorted out.
Thank you, Juha. Jihan, do you have a question for Juha? Please go to the microphone.
So let me ask a question. So this so-called Microsoft case,
Yeah.
So what you said is that it's being resolved in a in a fashion which the U.S. courts could have access to data held in other countries through mutual treaties or whatever, right? That's
no,
sort of
no,
the
not-
simplified version of that, right?
No, not quite. What
Okay.
happened was that the U.S. Basically law enforcement applied for a warrant, and they got it under U.S. domestic law, and then the court told Microsoft, look, you have to hand over the data. Microsoft said, no, we can't do that because it's stored in Ireland, in a data center in Ireland.
Right. No, I'm saying the final you said it looks like it's going to be resolved through international treaties and.
Well, it's not. I'm not sure it's going to be in the treaty format because again we're talking about sort of legal definitions here, but it looks like there would be a mechanism put into place whereby the U.S. courts will be able to authorize foreign governments or the law enforcement speak to foreign governments to get the data. So there'll be a process in place. There's a law which is absolutely called the Cloud Act, which is, I'm trying to actually remember what the abbreviation for it, but it's about lawful access to data. And it probably be different from the MLATs. I mean, Craig can probably talk about more than that because he's the legal expert here. But they're looking at something that would be faster. I mean, the MLAT treaty thinks it's quite slow. You have to go back and forth and, check each other law and everything else, but...
Oh, okay. Anyway, okay.
So,
let me really get to my question, which was something else. Is what about in a different way? For example, if there was a law enforcement agency, let's say in Nepal,
Yeah.
and they wanted some access to data held in the US. Now, what I see from what you said is it's going to be easy for people in the US to get data from other countries, but just as difficult from, say, the police in Nepal to get something in the US. Would that be a correct assessment?
I can perhaps answer that.
Yeah.
So the whole Microsoft problem, Microsoft versus US DOJ problem, is intended to be resolved by the Cloud Act that Juha mentioned.
Yeah.
So the Cloud Act actually stands for Clarifying Lawful Overseas Use of Data, which is Cloud Act. It tries to do two things. The first thing is that it allows the courts in the US to order companies based in US to disclose data that they hold elsewhere without breaching US laws. So it enables the companies like Microsoft to release it with legal protection. The second thing that it's trying to do is to allow law enforcement agencies from outside America to request information through the US system, not going through MLAT, but through the Department of Justice. So basically using the Department of Justice as a post office and allowing the Department of Justice in the US to then demand data held in the US from these US bodies. So it's trying to overcome that MLAT problem because with the MLAT, as you know, you go through a very long treaty process. So this is trying to overcome that. But in the process, does it threat on other people's territory? That's the question that we can actually have a discussion afterwards. But sorry.
Yeah, well, that's the whole, again, the tricky bit there, solving the whole committee thing there.
Exactly.
And just because the US writes this particular law doesn't mean it's acceptable for other countries.
Exactly.
So
yes.
we'll see where it ends up and if it will be an international acceptable solution as well. We don't know that yet.
Absolutely.
Can I make a comment? So there has been actually some kind of talks which say that the countries with the strictest law, maybe in privacy law or whatever, actually can have some kind of possibility to rule over the whole other countries. So I think that's the problem which now generates all over the world, right?
Yeah, it's a fantastic segue for us to start. Thank you, Juha, very much. Thank you. It's a fantastic segue for us to now talk to get Jingdi to see if we can get the technology working. But I'd like to come back, and I see Jesse there doing a research and nodding his head, so I'll be asking you a question later on, so be prepared. Thank you.
Okay, sorry everyone for the display failures, and let me check if it can. Oh, okay, it can work. I'm sorry. now let's continue. First, I'll give the definitions of the cross-border flow. I'll call it CBDF for short. And we can say in some early literature, they call it the flows of information. And for the UN, OECD, and EU, they call CBDF just as the trans-border data flows. And in US and Australia, they usually call it cross-border data flows. And so we can say different organizations give the different definitions. So we can give our definition, CBDF as the movement of machine-readable data crossing national borders through the internet and the information systems. And in part 2, I'll introduce the 3 modes of CBDF. And the first mode is cross-border flow of specific data is strictly prohibited. Such as in Russia, Australia, Korea, and China, in this country, some very important data, if they want to cross out of the country, they must be strictly restricted. And we can see some acts and the core contents of it. And the advantages of this mode is they improve the country's control of core and sensitive data, and the rules is simple and easy to follow. Next, the second mode is the conditional permission for cross-border data flow. That means the transmission do the transmission safety evaluation. So the pros is it can ensure data security and the right to self-determination of data subject. But there are also some disadvantages, such as the ambiguity of rules, such as the consent of data subject, and it's hard to comply with the law. And the third mode is the backup of the CBDF in the internal area, such as in Indonesia, Nigeria, and Brunei. In this country, the localized data will be backup and storage in their own data center. And so in part 3, I'll show the evolution of CBDF management in US and EU. There are several phases from 2007 and 2015 October. It's the phases of safe harbor. And the background of this phase is the U.S. is a world leader in information technology, and it protects personal data and privacy mainly by industry self-discipline. But in EU, they protect the flow of personal cross-border data by strict legislations, and they have the rules such as the data protection directive and some other rules. So in order to close the gap between the US and EU and improve cross-border data flow to promote the transatlantic trade, this safe harbor phase. And the main contents include the membership and the promise to compliance with 7 principles, and they also give the punishment of violation, such as the reclaiming the certification and publishing the country's thoughts, submitting to the FTC, and take some illegal actions. And then we can go to the transition phase. It is just from 2015 October to 2016 February, and it begins with in 2013, the Austrian, he filed a class action lawsuit on Facebook to Irish data protection regulators. And on October 6, 2015, the European Court of Justice announced the safe harbor is invalid. So in order to help American and the European enterprises to go through the period when the safe harbor is invalid and the new agreement hasn't been signed, then going to the transition phase. There are some main cons, such as if the American enterprise has signed the standard contract terms with EU memberships, and they promise to fulfill the data protection obligations according to the contract, they can transfer cross-border data. And then we can go into the binding business rules. It's just it was from 2015 October to 2016 February, and we can see it is an alternative to the safe harbor. And the third phase is the US-EU Privacy Shield. It's just consideration the failure of the safe harbor and adjust the rules on US-EU CBDF in post-Snowden area. And the main contexts such as the Privacy Shield principles and two attachment about matters and the matters of U.S. Department of Commerce. It also have 5 letters from the FTC, DOT, National Intelligence Council of Office, the State Council, and so on. So the benefits of this phase is it provided a reference for data preservation and transmission, promotion in transatlantic trade and investment partnership agreement, and it helped to create a win-win and mutually beneficial digital business system. And there are also the US-EU umbrella agreement. It is aimed to strengthen the trust in data exchange and process of law enforcement in the EU and the US. We can see the main contents such as data usage restriction, data transfer condition, data preservation period, and data acquisition and modification. Also some leakage notification and judicial relief and implementation. Okay, and let's go into the part 4. I'll introduce some CBDF management of the international organizations. We can see from these 2 tables, just from the 2005 November to the to now, just 2007 September, there are the main organizations such as the EC, GSMA, B20, and OECD, APEC, SPP, and so on. We can see in this table about the name of their guidelines or rules and their propositions of it. So I won't give the details for it. And so we can see the opportunities and challenges for developing countries about the CBDF. For the opportunities, such as it can accelerate the economic and trade growth, and also strengthen international exchange. But there are also many challenges, such as it increases the developing countries' dependency on information from developed countries, and it also increases the threats of the data subjects and harms the national information safety. So opportunities and challenges we can say in this slide. And the last part, maybe I'll give some implications for the developing countries. First, I think the developing countries should improve the management of CBDF, such as guarantee national security, promote the industry development, and protect personal privacy. And second, maybe they can improve domestic legislation and establish the specialized regulatory agencies, such as establish the systematic data legal protection system in existing international framework system, and establish the regulations related to network information protection. And also some specialized data regulatory agencies, and meanwhile establish and improve data transmission safety assessment mechanisms and technology monitoring means. Also, I think developing countries can establish industry self-discipline systems to assure enterprises to protect the personal data, such as introduce international information security management standards, for example, the ISO or IEC 2701, or the ISO IEC 29100 privacy framework standard. And also they can strengthen their own information security and obtain the international information security certification, such as the ISO or CCEVS. And lastly, the developing countries should strengthen the international cooperation and actively take part in the formulation of international rules. For example, they can take part in APEC, cross-border privacy rules systems, and other regional data systems, and also participate in international exchange and dialogue, and strive for establish the cross-border data regional regulatory organizations, and draw up the international agreements on issues that happen frequently. Okay, that's all my presentation, and thank you.
So I think Jingdi has provided us a really detailed information about what's going on in different countries, and also what kind of international efforts are happening right now. But I think Jingdi has focused more about more on developing countries and the impact of all these kind of cross-border legal issues happening right now. But what I also want to emphasize here is that it's also impacting all the people living in developed countries as well. For example, bioinformatics, bio data, which have been collected by so many tracking consumer products such as Google, Clock or whatever. It can also harm all the people based in developed countries as well. And even your search results in Google, you can somehow collect all the data which cannot be even imaginable from some people who are using that kind of search results, because there is some kind of, because I am also based in academia as well. I know what kind of research efforts have been done by using all these kind of personal research, personal like search history, like through Google or whatever. So like, I really think that it's impacting like all of us, not only in like developing countries, but it's impacting like all the people on this earth. Yes.
Okay, I think it's enough talking from us. I'm going to open up the floor to you guys to share your thoughts. You know, we talk a lot today about the ways different countries are trying to address the issue. I mentioned specifically the US Cloud Act. Now, Jesse, I'm putting you on the spot. I'm not sure whether you've followed this, but it's kind of in your domain, isn't it? Are you happy to talk a little bit about what you think? Yep. No? Okay. So conceptually, what do you think? I mean, sorry, I just need to stretch my leg. Okay, I need to stretch my legs. So we talk a lot about, you know, and it's a pet subject for me as well, the extra territoriality. So I mentioned the Privacy Act from the European Union. Do any of you feel that you have to comply with GDPR in your work or in your work? Does your organization talk about GDPR? You do? And are you based in the EU?
Hi, Ashley Jones with Packet Clearinghouse. Our headquarters are actually based in the United States, but most of our constituents are globally centered, so we're not following mainly US law, but we look at, instead of the lowest common denominator, we have to look at the highest common denominator. So that way, we impose GDPR rules across all users. We're in the process of rolling out for the May 25th deadline, whenever it is. Yep. So it's just been raising the bar for everyone, and everyone gets the same benefits of being able to delete data, that they're the ownership, all the GDPR good stuffs. Yeah.
Sure. Say hi to Woody.
I will.
So, I mean, APNIC is obviously in the Asia-Pacific region. Do you think we need to comply with GDPR? I'm putting you on the spot.
I'm the software engineer doing the implementation,
right.
So I get a new legal appreciation of it. Though internally we did decide to do that, so if you have sites that you're running, that you have constituents or customers that are based in the AP region, mm-hmm. I don't think it hurts. It may be more work if you need to onboard everyone to agree to the new terms, to update the account, to make sure it's in compliance. I like it. Our approach is very thorough, such that we're actually going to delete accounts for people that don't opt in. So we purge those proactively, meaning we're not liable because we don't have the data anymore.
Right. And I like that approach. And that's an approach that we take, not necessarily because we think that we are under the jurisdiction of the EU courts, because we're nowhere near there. And I'll be interested to hear from, I think we've got friends from Nepal, friends from China, you know, as to what they think. I mean, we are, you know, APNIC is based in Australia. Mm-hmm. We serve some 56 countries in the Asia-Pacific region. We cannot possibly comply with laws that a country impose upon us without consulting us. But GDPR is interesting because it's privacy principles, and the privacy principles are fairly generic. The Australian privacy principles, which have been in place since 1988, is almost exactly the same as the GDPR. So from our point of view, our position is that we don't think we're bound or covered or subject to the jurisdiction of the laws of European Union of all places, nor are we to US, for example. But we do accept that best practice is a good thing, and if the GDPR has practices that we don't adopt but we think it's a good thing, then we do it because it's a good thing to do.
The tricky part then is if there are subsequent amendments to GDPR that we think are bad ideas, or that are more commercially centric as opposed to privacy centric, right?
Yes.
Then we get into tricky issue.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But thank you very much for your contribution. Yeah. Well, the GDPR seeks to extend to countries which is not in the EU, but if you provide services or target services to European residents, you know, how do you do that? I mean, so the European courts can't make us turn up in a court in Belgium and listen to a court there. But this is exactly the case of the Canadian case, the Google case. Maybe I'll get Yusu to talk about the Google case. Are you happy to talk about? I can talk about it. So this is a case which Google is actually not involved. Google is a third party. It's a case between two parties about intellectual property rights, nothing to do with Google. But one of the parties to the litigation went to court and asked the court to issue an order to require Google to remove a link. So when you search the company, it doesn't come up. But it requires Google to do that in the whole world, which Google is not happy about, because if you can have a country that can order Google to do something that affects the whole world, then that is not good from Google's point of view, because then Google would then be subject to the laws of every single country in which it has subscribers. So, but that went all the way to the highest court in Canada, and the order stood. But then Google went to the US court when it finally ended in the Canada, and the US court says to Google that, no, you don't have to comply because we don't accept that the Canada law binds you. So that is a case of having countries not respecting each other's sovereignty and jurisdiction that Juha was talking about. But you know, it's an interesting point. Do you guys experience laws being imposed upon you from other countries? I see John Crane nodding. So John, ICANN is all over the world. Oh, so you look like John Crane. Can you please not wear that hat? Sorry, John Brewer. Okay, I'll let you off. Jesse.
So sorry, I haven't been following the Cloud Act, but the GDPR stuff and the Data Protection Directive, I wrote my master's thesis on the Data Protection Directive and the U.S. Safe Harbor and all that kind of good stuff. So when I was doing the research for that, a lot of international legal scholars as well as international relations scholars characterized the Data Protection Directive as one of the first salvos of the European Union flexing its muscle as a cohesive political unit, to say we too can, it's not just the United States, we too can affect global policy and can affect global regulation. So in many ways, under that interpretation, the Data Protection Directive is not only a mechanism for protecting EU citizens' privacy, but also a flexing of political muscle. So in that case, they are intentionally imposing their interpretation of the fair information principles onto the rest of the world, and that was in some interpretations an intentional act. And so some I just skimmed over the Cloud Act, and in some ways the U.S. the Cloud Act is the U.S. pushing back on that and trying to alter the scope such that their firms cannot hide behind jurisdictional barriers, but also it's in a way, again, it's a jurisdictional extension. So there's some of these I would say that the GDPR is just the next is the improvement of the Data Protection Directive now with somewhat more real teeth. So that's so I would say yes that
do you so in those discussions, I mean, with legal scholars, did you ever touch upon the enforceability of GDPR?
The what?
The actual enforceability of that act against someone who is actually not in the country, not in the EU, not in the jurisdiction.
So I mean, that's a point of that's still a point of contention because it hasn't it's not coming in, it's just coming into effect now. So so a lot of the arguments are around whether the new data privacy authorities that for each one of those countries, how much how willing they are, because at least in my research on the early data protection directive, the only enforcement that occurred within Europe was the lowest hanging fruit, where you had a grossly insecure service. All of the other fair information practices, like the appropriateness and the utility of what you agreed to, what you consented to your data being used, none of those were prosecuted, to my knowledge. If there's someone else who has better data on this, since I did that work, please correct me. So it didn't really have any teeth, and it was generally considered to be kind of an empty formalism. But from the folks I've spoken with about GDPR, the folks analyzing it, it supposedly will have additional teeth, and that's so.
Thank you. I mean, that's how I look at it. I think the power is in the embarrassment. So in an APNIC situation, I think I am very clear that they have no jurisdiction over us. They can't actually compel us to do anything, but they could bring an action in the EU in our absence, and then have a media release out and says APNIC does not comply. We found them guilty. Exactly, it's a signal thing, and that is effective to that extent. But Aftab, hello.
Hi, Aftab Siddiqui. Strictly speaking, in my personal capacity.
Concerned internet citizen?
In the other room, not here.
Okay, not concerned.
Just a very irresponsible net citizen here. Regardless of the good, bad, and ugly, how ugly GDPR is, I'm not commenting on the merits of jurisdiction or not. At least we can pick up the good stuff from the GDPR. And I'm asking about the APNIC. We are based in Australia. Now we have the mandatory data breach policy in effect, which I mean, is strange. The jurisdiction of that policy is still very unclear, but at least we can pick up the right stuff from the GDPR and at least implement it in the best possible manner, like the policy of consent, having a data security officer, or having a mandatory data breach policy. I would like to commend APNIC when notifying the community when there was an issue with the WHOIS data. And they came forward and say, well, we found an issue and we are fixing it ourselves. So why can't we make a policy out of it and create a better place?
Thanks, Aftab. People would think that Dorothy digs that question for you. Two messages. The first one, as I said, is that the APNIC is under the jurisdiction of Australia, and the Australian Privacy Principles, which is enacted under the Australian Privacy Act, is an act in 1988, and it has a set of 12 privacy principles that we've been complying for a very long time. So if any of you in your interaction with APNIC have been asked to provide information to APNIC, for example, if you're subscribing to a mailing list or you're signing up as an APNIC member, or actually subscribing to our newsletters or blog, you would have seen the stuff that the warning that we have, the statement about privacy. So we say before we even collect any information, and we've been doing this for actually the last 3 years, this particular aspect. So we've been saying that before we collect any information, we want to tell you why we are collecting this information. And this is the reason why and if you don't provide this information, what are the consequences? And if you want to find out about how we handle your information, go here. And so that's on every single page. So we've adopted that. And in many ways, we've adopted it ahead of the GDPR. So we've been doing that for a very long time. There are some new things in the GDPR that we don't have in the Australian privacy principles. Some of them relate to, machine processing. So the right of an individual to ask for an individual to assess your data rather than to have a computer. So, for example, if you go and borrow money from a bank and make an application, under the GDPR, you have the right to say, I don't want the computer to say no. I want an individual to actually assess my application on its merit. So I think in answer to your question, I totally agree with you that we should do best practice. So if the principles are good, we should do it. And my point is that the principles are good, but they are simply a reflection of what we are already doing because we've been doing it for a while. And on the other, I think, point about the data breach, in Australia, we don't have the data breach law, a disclosure law yet. It's coming into force shortly, and your point is very valid, that when it happened to us, we actually did all the things that we would have been required to do under the Act, even though the Act is not there, because we're doing it according to best practice.
Yeah, Aftab Siddiqui again. Just a closing remark on that. It would be a great idea for APNIC to share all the best practices which they are following, which already are mentioned in the GDPR, and tell the community, well, we are doing much better than what we have been asked in the GDPR, and there are some missing pieces which we can follow later on or something. It will give us some sort of confidence to the community that, well, okay, fine. If GDPR is not at least applicable here, I'm much better in this situation. I'm not concerned. So it's my request to APNIC, then create a report or something that we are already complying with this, even though we are not under the jurisdiction of GDPR.
Thank you, Aftab. People will think that we're colluding because we're actually doing that. But thank you very much. Hi.
Hello, Joyce from ICANN, but I'm asking out of personal curiosity. So the first one is, does the GDPR impact the APNIC WHOIS? And related to that, are there conversations around whether IP address numbers are considered personally identifiable data?
Thank you very much. Does it impact the WHOIS? The short answer is no. The reason for that is because GDPR and the privacy principles work on the basis of what is appropriate and what is reasonable in the circumstances. So the APNIC WHOIS serves very important functions for archival purposes, for contact purposes, for internet security, for internet badness attribution purposes. So we believe that that is a proper and proportionate basis to collect the information and to use the information for that reason. Number one. Number two, when we collect the information from people, we tell them that that information is going to be used in this manner. So, so the GDPR does not prevent the disclosure of information. It just prevents the disclosure of information without the consent, and in circumstances where it's not acceptable or unreasonable. On the questions on whether IP address is personal identifying information, the short answer is yes and no. It depends on the circumstances. On the basis of the APNIC database, no. Because when you look at a block of address, and I'm getting a bit technical here, when you look at a block of address and who is the operator of the network, it actually doesn't go down to an individual person actually using behind a computer. But so the answer to whether the IP address is PII is who are you talking about and in whose hand you're talking about. So in the hand of an ISP that can match an IP address to a person behind a computer, then in those hands, in that circumstance, it's PII. But in WHOIS, when it's up at that level, no, it's not. Yes, but sorry. Okay. Yep, sure.
So to answer, I can join Craig's answer with that, because like as a representative of the anti-abuse community who also does private enforcement of certain norms, best practices around messaging, things like that. We've had multiple sessions at MOG about GDPR and whether the way we use IP addresses in effect when we imbue a set of numbers with reputation because they're spewing out spam, they're sitting out DDoS, all that kind of stuff. It's quite a point of contention of whether that's actually considered PII, because are you blocking individual users? There's also court cases, and I'll dig these out and send them to Craig, because I'm actually speaking about this next week and doing my homework on it. But there are court cases that have already come out that saying IP addresses are PII, and the GDPR also has a caveat for in the public safety and police directives of the GDPR that say under these circumstances you can still use private information for for police actions and public safety. So there are derogations of the broader privacy principles for particular purposes. But I'll send Craig my references and he can pass them on. And now I have to run off to my
Thanks,
interview
Jesse.
session.
See you. Thank you. Yeah.
Right. This is Gihan from Sri Lanka. So I want to shift topic away from GDPR to offshore data. So one problem we have is storing data offshore. And so what happens if something happens? I'm not really talking of privacy here anymore. I'm talking of, for example, a seizure or just some other commercial issue, maybe some commercial dispute between two providers, anything else. Now how do we get hold of that data? And I believe that from the point of view of a small country, there are sort of two approaches. One is we could try to have multilateral or bilateral, I don't know, whatever lateral approaches to try to harmonize that. And in a way, I think EU is trying to sort of do that in the sense, well, EU is multilateral in itself. The other one is, again, maybe like what US has been doing, have domestic laws with some kind of extraterritorial effect. Obviously, US is slightly bigger than Sri Lanka, but what, as is addressed to the entire panel, what do you think we, as maybe slightly smaller countries, could do? Is it better to do multilateral or to look at domestic laws and try to enforce them somehow?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, thank you for the comment, and I generally agree with you. And so actually that was basically my question, and that was the point that I wanted to point out in this session. So what kind of answers or what kind of solutions can come out from this community, from Asian community? Should it be based in multilateral treaties, or should it be based in just domestic legislation following maybe the US or EU models? Or can it be some kind of technical, can there be some technical solutions for this? So that was actually my question to the audience here. So I actually want to listen to your opinion more. So and because we haven't actually talked about what kind of technical solutions can be brought up to solve this question, if there can be someone who can talk about this from.
I might ask Babu. I mean, from my sort of legal hat, I'm thinking that in the discovery process, you might be able to compel, a party to a legal action to reveal information that they have control over. What do you think? Sorry, Babu. For Babu.
Okay, thank you. I was just thinking about various regional and international frameworks about developing a framework. For example, when Europe builds certain laws for themselves, then there is one carteling, right? European versus non-European. And if we build that kind of regional and sub-regional frameworks, then it will be very difficult for a small country or small players to come up with solutions. For that purpose, I think certain level of understanding or framework should be there under UN regime or like that on this kind of data protection issues, rather than fragmenting the jurisdictions. On other hand, for example, around more than 50% transactions are with India. For example, let's take Nepal. If we have that level of exchange with a particular jurisdiction, then why not to have that kind of arrangement as well? At least we solve 50% issues, right? So this is very difficult situation to address, but any universal kind of arrangement will be far better to address these kind of things.
Thank you. I think that's a really good sort of solution that addresses quickly an issue. But there is no sort of multilateral framework, as far as I understand it, dealing with civil claims. Criminal, yes, and it's already very slow despite the urgency. But I think civil claim. I think if I have to answer to that, I probably won't be here. But thank you very much for your participation. We've got 3 minutes left, and what I might do is allow our speaker to have some closing remark, maybe just a very quick 30 seconds closing remark if you have any, and then I'll close the session. I might start with you, Yesu.
So, like, thank you for attending this session. And so, like, what I got to think after, like, attending all these kind of sessions or just being engaged in all these, like, data transaction or whatever, like, talks, I just got to think that, like, actually we might be thinking about, like, data in too vague way. Like, for example, we are talking about big data, but, like, there is some kind of, like, there is so many, like, types of data, like, such as, like, financial data or, like, biodata or all these, like, different types of data. So, like, we might somehow, like, need to fragment, like, what kind of data we are referring to, maybe in the future, but, like, not at this moment, but, like, maybe in the future, all these kind of, like, types of data can be, like, like deferred and then like maybe thought out in law in the future. So that's what I want to write in this remark.
Thank you. Jingti, anything to say to close?
And thank you everyone for here. And nowadays, my colleagues from CICT, they are all here, and we have done more things about on the cross-border flows, also on the network security. And I think we'd like to discuss more things with you. Thank you.
Thank you.
UN Untitled has one model law on e-commerce, right? Similarly, if we develop certain model laws on data protection, that will address at the beginning of national level. So that will be exemplary for all, most of the national framework. So that could be departing point for robust data protection laws. Thank you.
Thank you. Look, thank you very much for staying up here or holding you up for dinner. But thank you very much for your participation and your interest. But will you join me in thanking my panelists, please? Thank you.